Hi everyone, this is week 2, part 1, and Karl Marx. So first up, in chronological order of birth, is Karl Marx, who was a journalist, he was an activist, a writer, a refugee to London, very much a family man, and something of a pugilist in that he was a bit of a he's a bit of a fighter, really. I'm sure you all know something about Marx already. He's a huge figure in history, likened to Jesus and Muhammad for the sheer impact that he's had in the world. He's had many cult-like followers, and his work, a bit like the Bible, can be interpreted in a number of ways too. His influence extends to countries which have become, I guess, communist experiments, and some of them are already still regarded as communist. So Russia, China, North Korea, Vietnam, for example. But his influences are also with those who've made social reforms like welfare. In some cases, or the argument is, to ward off what they thought was sort of rabid or wild communists. So let's put reforms in place and then we won't have a revolution, was kind of the idea. During the 20th century, there was a splintering of his ideas, which we'll talk about later, particularly in the week on Western Marxism. He was born in 1818 in a now German town. It was Prussia at the time, so that's why I call it. That's why I said that it's now German. Originally founded by the Roman. He has a Jewish background, but his father did convert to Protestant Christianity so that he could work as a lawyer, because as you would know, Jews were excluded from many professions. Actually came from quite a comfortable middle class background. He was at university though when his father died, and he suddenly had to think about working to support himself. He became a journalist and he wrote for a liberal journal, the Rheinische Gazette. But he attracted attention from the then Prussian, now German government, and decided to leave Germany as he thought he'd have more freedom to express himself elsewhere. So he moved to Paris in 1843 and then couldn't return to Germany. So he was a political refugee. He was then expelled from Paris in 1849, and you might like to follow up some of the reasons for all of this. Lived in London then for the rest of his life. In England, he was often very, very poor, couldn't afford medicine for his children, so he had a great deal of experience of poverty, and he had 7 children. Only 3 of his 7 children survived to adulthood, a not unusual experience for those times. There is a story that he had a child by his maid, Helene de Muth, and that child was sent out to be cared for by foster parents. Friedrich Engels claimed paternity of the child though, and then the child was placed in a working class foster home. Again, not unusual for the time. And Karl Marx's daughter Eleanor found out about this supposed child after her father died and made him a family friend. Now, I'm not sure if there's any truth or whatever, and there doesn't seem to be any concrete evidence that this child did belong to Karl Marx. Despite the poverty, though, in much of his life, he ended his life quite comfortably well off, particularly with the aid of his friend Engels, Friedrich Engels. There's again an argument that he was a bit of a spendthrift, so he might have created some financial difficulties for himself anyway. He was often very ill, apparently had a skin disease, and Friedrich Engels remained a very good friend throughout Marx's life. But apparently, and this might go back to the point about him being a pugilist, he didn't have a lot of other friends. By the time he died, his writings were beginning to have some impact, but he never had very much of a following in Britain. And although this is one of the most famous images of Marx, one that you're probably very familiar with, apparently during the final years of his life, he was clean shaven. His head was shaven and his beard as well. He'd done philosophy at university, and I'll return to that, but in London he turned really to history and to economics. So I've mentioned Friedrich Engels, a very long time friend of Marx's, also helped him out with money, as I said, and with writing. They co-authored the Communist Manifesto, and I'd encourage you to read that if you haven't already done so. That was published in 1848. Engels edited the 2nd and 3rd volumes of Das Kapital after Marx's death. So he's quite an important figure. He came from a very privileged family, but did have quite liberal ideas of individual freedom. His father was an industrialist and owned a textile factory, but I guess Engels saw himself, and we would see him as a socialist philosopher. So he kind of lived this double life. He presented as a businessman. He operated his father's factory in Manchester in England, and after hours, though, he wrote articles on communism and read up on social conditions in England. And he lived with a woman called Mary Burns. He didn't marry her, he lived with her, but he didn't marry her because he had rejected the institution of marriage. And Mary Burns was an uneducated Irish working woman. So in that respect, he was living out some of his values. After Marx's death in 1883, then Engels served as the foremost authority on Marx's work. So I'll go back to Marx now. So that's Engels is an important figure here, but I'll talk mostly about Marx and his influence on sociology. So he had read Auguste Comte on positivism, and he was and Comte, of course, is coined the whole word sociology, and is also a founding father. But Marx actually wasn't a fan of sociology at all. He was opposed to this idea. Well, I guess what he saw the sociologists as doing as producing theories on how society worked. But he was opposed to that. He wanted to use theory as a guide to practical political action. So he didn't want to just sit around and often there is that complaint of university boss sitting in an ivory tower. And certainly Karl Marx was very opposed to that. He wanted to make change. He has influenced the development of social theory through Max Weber, through Emil Durkheim, etc., etc. So that's kind of his influence. So even though he wasn't a fan of sociology, he's an influence on other people who've been important in the field. He's also influenced non-Marxists. So Max Weber wasn't a Marxist, but he's an influence, and Anthony Giddens have come up through Marx and have tossed in, I guess, some counterpoints to his position and thought about Marxist ideas from more contemporary standpoints, at least in the case of Giddens. He's also been adapted, of course, by some sociologists, for example, Pierre Bourdieu. The influence on Marx, it was Hegel. If you've done some philosophy, then you will have come across him as well, a German philosopher born in 1770 and died in 1831. Some actually say, if you look in some of the sociology textbooks, some say that Hegel is a foundational thinker for sociology, along with another German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who, and his dates are 1724 to 1804. So Marx was influenced by Hegel, who's an idealist philosopher. So he had this idea that there is one universal mind, and our individual minds are a limited, very particular manifestation of that. So he separated out what we call the natural world from this universal mind or spirit, and he called that the absolute or the universal. And that for him is reality, and our minds are fragments of this one universal mind. You'll find that there's a very similar idea. In some ways he reminds me of Plato, and you'll find that there's very similar ideas in religious traditions such as Hinduism and Christian Science. So the world, the material world that we live in, is not reality. Instead, reality is the absolute or the universal, this other mind, and we're just fragments of that. What does that have to do with Marx? We'll come to that. Another influence, though, was Ludwig Feuerbach, and he's another German philosopher. He's best known, his dates are 1804 to 1872, and he's best known for his book, The Essence of Christianity, which was a critique of Christianity. And he advocated very liberal ideas. He was an atheist, and he was a materialist, meaning that he believed that consciousness is shaped by our material lived experience. Famously, he said, we are what we eat. So Marx is a materialist. He has the idea that our need to survive, our actual material existence, is what shapes our consciousness. He believed that there's an end game for human life, telos, and it is communism. So that's the direction in which humanity is moving. And he believed that human progress proceeds through class struggles. So we've moved from feudalism to capitalism, and then we're moving onwards to communism. So he has what might be called a materialist social ontology, and ontology is thinking about the nature of existence. For example, what the world is made up from a physics point of view, for example, atoms, but also other examples, the nature of time, the nature of the human body, etc. His materialist social ontology is that consciousness, our thinking, our awareness, our perception, our cognizance is shaped by human activity in the world, not by a universal or divine mind. So he's not an idealist, so he's opposed to Hegel in that respect. So the essence of humanity is our social nature. We can only develop our potential in a free society, is what he believed. And at the core of poverty and oppression is the way in which society is organised. So at the core of that, the core cause is social organisation. And change, therefore, requires material transformation, not a change in consciousness. Historical materialism is another key point. Some people might call that dialectical materialism as well. He believed that we've gotten to this point in history, industrialization, thinking back to Marx's time, through class struggle. So that's how we've got to the particular point that we're at. And class struggles are what produces new modes of production, and new modes of production produce new forms of social organisation. Now, these modes of production are an important concept in Marxism. The forces of production, the instruments of production, we'll talk about that first. So first, the forces of production. So the instruments, the tools, the machinery, the computers that are actually used. The raw materials that we use, the oil, wheat, cotton, whatever, the labour power, so that's the human physical strength, the skills that we have working together cooperatively, and the information that we use, and then the infrastructure. So there's four of these forces of production. Infrastructure, of course, is things like buildings and roads, and these days the internet as well. The other element in terms of modes of production for Marx was the social relations of production, how a particular society organises the way in which we produce things. So we can have serf or peasants working for the owner of the land, which we did have prior to industrialisation. We can have the workers, or the group of people that Marx called the proletariat, working for owners of business, so it's capitalism, and shareholders now as well we have. And we can have three, a communist state ownership, where everything, the means of production, the forces of production are owned by everybody in the society. When it comes to class struggle, we've seen this shift from feudalism, so from peasants working the land for landowners, to capitalism, so that we had the proletariat, the working class, working in factories for the bourgeoisie, for the owners of those factories. For Marx, under capitalism, the working class is actually related to each other because of the mode of production. So he didn't see ties of family, community, and religion as important as that they become a group because they're working together for the owners. He saw the proletariat, the working class, as wage slaves, and he believed that more and more workers would actually become wage slaves, which would lead to a revolution resulting in communism, so that everybody eventually owns the means of production. What comes first, the mode of production, or the economic base of a society, or the social relations of production, the political and the ideological, so the values and beliefs of the superstructure, how things are organised? Marx believed that the economic base of a society produced the way in which a society is organised. I just want to mention this idea about use value versus exchange value. So capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production with the intent to make a profit. And along with that is the idea that that profit is made in a competitive, continually changing and expanding market. So use value is the value of an object for its own use. So raising chickens, as you might do in your backyard, to eat their eggs. But if you go sell those eggs, then that changes to an exchange value. So the value of an object. So raising the eggs then to sell those eggs, and then the eggs become commodities. So the concept of human labour, of course, is fundamental in capitalism. Human labour can produce more value than it needs to stay alive. And for Marx, humans are exploited under capitalism. So therefore, human labour becomes a commodity to be exchanged. So there's labour value, the value of labour that's needed to produce itself. So the energy that's expended when we go to work, and the energy that we need then to replace that lost energy, so food, shelter and rest, for example. And then there's the surplus value, the profit that's made by exchanging the product above the value of what it costs to produce it. So for example, it costs 2 cents perhaps to produce an egg and costs 41 cents to buy one. Then the difference between that is the surplus value. Then another important concept or concepts is those of commodification and alienation. So where everything becomes a commodity, where human labour is a commodity, Marx is saying that people therefore, when we live in a social life that's then dominated by this idea of commodification, where everything is about exchanging things for money, then people do feel alienated from their nature, which for Marx is. So he says that we're then alienated from the products that we produce, we're alienated from our labour, which is forced from us, and we're alienated from ourselves because we're forced to do work that we might not otherwise want to do, and we're alienated from others in this system of competition, etc. Karl Marx believed that the workers would develop this revolutionary consciousness, that the workers would become aware of sharing grievances against the ruling or the owning classes, and therefore form a class in itself. And it's only through a mass movement or a collective of workers becoming conscious of their grievances that they will be able to overthrow the capitalists. So in summary, Marx wasn't a sociologist, and he wasn't even a fan of sociology, but his work has influenced that field of knowledge, as well as, of course, many others. And some influences come as others think against his ideas, and some adapt his ideas for the 20th century.